Good evening, everyone. My name is Derek,
I'm Alair.
and we're going to spend the next hour and a half with you talking about navigating change and uncertainty. Before we get into introducing ourselves and content and all of that, let's just take a moment to open this in prayer. Father, we thank you for this space. I thank you, no matter the format, no matter the room that we're sitting in or who we're sitting with, we thank you that you are here. You are present, you are real, you are inviting us, you are encouraging us, you are challenging us. We thank you for Flood Church that gives us all individuals an opportunity to talk about these things, who's tuned in to you. We acknowledge that you are present and you are real. Amen.
Amen.
Once again, my name is Derek Olson.
And I'm Alair.
We're going to do a couple of minutes of introduction of ourselves and who we are together. We are a couple. We are married, in case you didn't see that. And then we'll talk a little bit, have a bit of an interaction with you, and then we'll get into some content.
So I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. That's what I do vocationally. I work with individuals, couples, and families using emotionally focused therapy. And I specialize in working with couples and families with young kids. I like working with the little ones, partly in some ways because we don't have them, and then I get to hang out with them and then send them home. But I've been in private practice since 2013, and I also supervise therapists who are in school or working towards licensure as well.
And as the proud husband, I do have to double click on that. The practice she runs is incredible, not only from an organizational standpoint, which you'll hear in a minute is where I do a lot of my work, but also how she just cares for individuals. And before marriage, I had a skeptical view of therapy, and now knowing it on this side, I firmly encourage it for everyone, especially in times like change and uncertainty. I spend my time doing a couple of different things. If you know me personally, you know I like to call myself a builder. It's really strange for me to talk about myself, especially as an Enneagram 3 who looks very highly upon themselves. It's hard to talk about yourself. But I'm a builder in a couple of different senses. Of course, I love building with wood. Again, if you know me personally, there's always a new project, a new table, something that I'm tinkering with. But more so, I'm a builder of people. I really, really enjoy building individuals in whatever life stage and whatever ways they want and need to be. But then also I help build organizations through the Ubuntu group. That's the organization that I run. We do consulting work on organizational development. We also do coaching for individuals in small groups. And we also do trainings as well and have this broad network of individuals who really get to help us do all that work. I also have a PhD in leadership studies and organizational development from the University of San Diego, where I'm an adjunct faculty member. So those are a few different parts of us. We would like to say, and this is our own little celebration because we can't go out to dinner tonight.
Yeah, right.
It was 9 years ago exactly tonight that we began dating, August 10th of 2011. Thank you, helping me out with my math. And it happened actually in Uganda. We were leading a team. We don't suggest you begin dating while leading a team, but it worked out for us, so we can't say don't do it.
And since that time, we have actually gotten to spend a lot of time with young couples. We actually gotten to officiate 2 weddings, and we really, really value that. And so we have some different ways that we're continuing to develop that we spend time with other couples, either as mentors for them, leading small groups and retreats. And this is just something new that's emerging that we're really excited about.
We also like to get out and explore as much as we can. One of our big favorite things to do is to visit national parks. This September, we're going to spend a few weeks up in the Northwest doing some backpacking and getting out and away. That's one of the ways we adventure.
Whenever people ask if we have kids, well, when Derek was finishing up his PhD, which he just recently finished, people asked if we had kids, and I said, no. Well, I said we have 2 fur children and a dissertation, so that's our 3rd child. So we do have 2 dogs that we absolutely love. Their names are Reagan and Teddy. Yes, after the presidents. If you ever want some love, let us know, and they would love to spend time with you.
Alair really wants them to be therapy dogs because they love being with people.
I do.
That's a bit about us. There's much more we could say, but it doesn't need to be said.
So even though this is a remote, virtual kind of gathering, we do want to hear from you all. And so in the chat feature, or the chat box, we want you to write down, if you want to, what are some words that come to mind when you think of the terms change and uncertainty, since that's what we're talking about tonight, is navigating change and uncertainty. So go ahead and type those in, and we're going to take a minute and just hear of some words that are coming in. Risk. I highly agree with that one.
Yes.
Unknown. Mm-hmm.
Lack of control.
Ooh, lack of control.
Fear.
Those are pretty spot on so far.
Well, there's no right or wrong answer here. Just
True.
I feel all of those when I think of. Yeah.
And I appreciate the honesty with those too.
Right. We have a list of a few others that we have just put together, just things that we were thinking about. Do you mind listing those off?
Yeah, so some of them are going to be similar, if not the exact same. Scary, uncertain, just the question of why. Exciting, anticipatory, unknown, a question of will it help or will it even matter? Hopeful, control, frustrating, unnecessary, constant, and anxious.
And again, this is just a list that we literally yesterday in the kitchen while we were cooking dinner put together of what we were feeling. And typically when we do have conversations like this, no matter the event, we have a big whiteboard and everyone in the audience gets to yell it out and we get to write it up there. Again, a little different these days. But we do this just to show that there is so much that is part of change and uncertainty. The clear nature of uncertainty is we don't know what it is, and thus we have a lot of different feelings and emotions about it.
Yeah.
Anything else on that?
No, I don't. There's in the.
More rolled in if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
Expectation, opportunity.
Expectation, opportunity.
Destabilizing.
Ooh, destabilizing.
Anxiety. Overwhelming.
Ooh, overwhelming. Yeah.
Yep. And we could spend the next probably 60 minutes doing this as well. But that's all part of it.
Yeah.
Going into kind of the core of what we're going to talk about tonight is that this uncertainty and change is an incredible opportunity. And if we had to distill this into one single line, it would be that change and uncertainty are a unique and unparalleled time or times for God to intervene in our lives and for us to choose his life-changing transformation. There's a whole lot there. But if we wanted to express one thing tonight, is that this is just that opportunity. There's a bit of a story here that we heard recently. This actually comes from a book by Wayne Mueller. The book is titled Sabbath. We together decided that this story would be called A Nun, Some Cows, and Herbs. You'll hear about it. A nun at a convent in New Mexico had this rhythm of every afternoon going out into the fields and hills surrounding the convent and picking herbs. And the convent owned a lot of this land, and so they had cows on it that they grazed, and then I'm assuming by a rancher or whatnot. And this nun would go out and get these herbs and use them for dinners and breakfasts and whatnot. Well, somewhere along the line, they brought in an environmental consultant who said, hey, you're doing a great job, but what if you only grazed part of the land and let the rest of the other part of the land rest and do what it needs to do? And the nun said, great, cool, we'll do it. After a couple of months, this nun who was going out and picking herbs started realizing, I'm seeing things that I haven't seen before. There were different types of grasses. And within a year or two, in the ungrazed area, there was about a dozen different types of new herbs. And she was amazed by this. She said, I didn't even know these were here. She hadn't seen them. And she surmised that, the cattle were always grazing, so it was keeping things really short, but they were also trampling things under. And this became this metaphor for her and her convent and for us today of there are a lot of things in our life that get trampled on. There are a lot of seeds that have been planted in our life by God, by friends, by family, that are good things that they would love to see grow. But because of what's going on in our typical life, we don't always have the opportunity to see them grow to their full extent. And Dallas Willard talked a lot about this in terms of stopping the daily routine. That we have these routines that drive us, but what happens when we stop? And that's part of Sabbath rhythms, of course, but we're in a unique time. We're in an uncertain time. We're in a changing time where we don't know exactly all that is changing. And so this time of dormancy that we are in, or hopefully we're coming out of at some point soon, is an invitation, and it's an opportunity. It's an invitation that God is offering and an opportunity for us to change really a new way of being.
It's a great picture. And I think that, sometimes in that story, we think about, okay, this new, like there's a lot of positive things and growth in that. And so I think sometimes in the midst of that seasons of change and uncertainty, we don't want to just put a silver lining around it and say, oh, everything is great, because all these good things are happening, because it's not. And there are a lot of not good things happening. And there's still an invitation for growth, though, in the midst of it.
Exactly. We're going to talk a little bit now about setting the stage. We'll talk a lot this evening about setting the stage, which is basically the environment that we're living in right now. But then we're also going to talk about 3 different characters that are on the stage with us and with everyone. The past 8 or 10 years, you've certainly heard these phrases, these terms, and it's actually seeped into a lot of popular Christian culture these days. And this really is a time to, if we've forgotten about these terms, to go back to them or to remember exactly what's going on, because both, specifically the latter one, is very, very important for the era that we currently live in. Chronos, this is normal time. You can see that there's a timeline here in essence. It's basically time moves in one direction, and there's little tick marks along the way. It's linear. This can also be physical space at certain times, and the little tick marks can really identify or be anything. Often we measure it in terms of seconds, days, years. It could be every time you get a new vehicle. It could be every time you go to the bathroom or jump on a Zoom call or watch church on YouTube. It could mean anything. And in these times, in Chronos times, there's always change and uncertainty, but they're very low levels, and they're almost imperceptible. Usually we tend to manage them away or just ignore them altogether. And so this is how we normally live life. This is how we lived life for most of us up until about mid-March or so.
Mid-March.
Then a Kairos moment happened. And Kairos is also a version of time, but it's a very different type of time. And you can see here, again, the line's going along, and something happens, that red kabam in the middle of that. And we can continue on in Chronos, going along that dotted line, or we can take a whole different direction. And the idea of Kairos is that it's a time when conditions are right for the accomplishment of critical action, an opportunity or a decisive moment. That's the literal Merriam-Webster definition. But there's also a biblical definition here that has a lot more depth and richness to it. In essence, it's a unique time for choosing. If you look at the biblical piece, it has to do with the original Greek of coming to a head. It's a time to take full advantage of 13 in Romans 5 about it being a short or a specific amount of time. The great thing about Kairos moments is they don't go on forever. There is a beginning and an end, and that's part of the hope that we should have in this time right now. There's also this vision in Matthew of when fruit ripens. Kairos is used in that way as well. And it's this idea that there's a bit of a mystery to fruit, because of course you need to water the tree and fertilize it and all of that, but we actually don't produce the fruit. The tree does that. But if you don't pick the fruit at the right time, one of 2 things will happen. Either it'll wither literally on the vine, or it's going to fall on the ground and rot, and in our case, our chickens in the backyard are going to eat it up. And so there's this opportunity where we have to pick that fruit, that it is a specific time, and it's really only a short window. Then there's also this idea in Mark that it's a time of when things are brought to a crisis. And I say this last because, of course, we are in very much a crisis as well. There are a lot of different types of Kairos moments in our lives. Typically, we experience them as individuals, say the death of a family member. That could be part of it. Sometimes we experience it as a group. So if you still have siblings and your mother dies, that's a Kairos moment. But this is unique for us in our history, I would say, for all generations alive, because we've never had a pandemic like this before in the last at least 100 years. And on top of that, there's another Kairos moment, at least one, and that's social justice. That's another thing that has been always part of our country, but is coming to a head right now. And there's a lot of change and uncertainty in that. And that is feeding itself. What am I missing? Anything?
I mean, I think about, I think a lot of times with those Kairos moments that it might be unique to an individual or, like you said, a family, but I think on such a massive scale, even for our church community that just recently had a loss of a very, very dear part of our community that we had to say goodbye to. And I think just on these like big scale groups of people, Kairos moments is a really unparalleled kind of experience.
And one of the unique things with the pandemic right now is that typically when you're in a Kairos moment, there will be other people in that with you, but there are always people outside of it who can be a support. And we don't necessarily have that right now because we all are being affected in significant, deep ways to different degrees as well. But everyone is going through this, and so it's hard to find someone who's a steady and a rock. And there are people out there, but because we're all going through it, we're all kind of struggling with the same piece as well. And so that's one of the unique things in this time. Alair and I are each going to give an example in our lives of a Kairos moment that happened within the past relatively few years. And just as an example of, if it's not a death, if it's not social justice, if it's not a pandemic, what might these look like in people's lives? And then we're going to use these two examples as we talk through the rest of the content.
So interesting that Derek mentioned that 9 years ago today we started dating. And it was not that long after that encountered a very unique Kairos experience. So a little context for that. So growing up, I had a really close relationship with my mom. And by close, I mean like enmeshed close. So too close. And so when Derek and I started dating and we're moving towards marriage, that caused a lot of strain, distress, pain in my relationship with my mom. And in essence, my experience, and I think our experience, was that we were cut off from that part of the family and experienced a lot of rejection and shame and criticism. And it was certainly, we both experienced how hard it was. It was unique for each of us. I think for me, what I found myself faced with was, in essence, this choice of, what do I want to pursue? Do I want to pursue health, which for me meant making a decision to marry this wonderful, incredible man, and that meant a lot of loss and a lot of pain, and or to kind of go back into this other unhealthy way of being with my family. And would love to say that there was a happy ending and things were resolved, and they're not. They're a lot better than they used to be, but they're not. And ultimately, though, I feel like seeing that arrow on the Kairos diagram of pointing in this different direction, I feel like it really did send me and us in a direction that was really, really good, but also really, really painful.
Yeah, those inflection things to life. And sometimes it's a drudge. Sometimes it takes a long time to get through it. And I remember that fall, we were still dating, not yet engaged, when we were driving up to my hometown, and you had started telling me about, hey, a couple weeks ago I started having these conversations with my mom, and at the time we both thought, it's a short-term thing, it'll work itself out, and it ended up being one of these Kairos moments for us. Yeah.
But yours has a happy ending, the one you're going to share.
It does. It does. About 5 years ago, I first applied to the PhD program. And this is, again, the PhD program at University of San Diego. And when I first applied during the fall of 2005, I thought I was a shoo-in. I thought I had done everything I needed to do. I took the GRE, did well, had all my transcripts together, wrote a killer cover letter, of course, met with faculty, and did everything that I thought I needed to do. And submitted it and thought, oh, I'll hear about the acceptance whenever they get around to it. And fast forward a month and a half, 2 months later, and I remember we were exactly where we were
Yep.
eating, downtown, Bottega Americana. We miss it a lot. Downtown, and Alair said, oh, weren't you supposed to hear today about the PhD program? I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot. Opened up my phone, and it was worse than just your heart sinking. It was this way, like, no, like, they sent the wrong email to me. Like, I was supposed to get a different email, and of course this was a thank you for applying. We really appreciate it. All of that is a rejection letter. And I just remember sitting there stunned and being like, I thought this would be a huge part of the next 4 years of our life, and it's now gone. And wow, the loss that was there, the anxiety of what now was palpable. And what I ended up doing, I very quickly decided, okay, that was my one shot. I'm done with it, and I'm going to move on with life. And that wasn't quite how it worked out. There was about 4 or 5 months of I really didn't think about it. I put it out of sight, out of mind. But there was still something percolating there. There was still something growing. And about, I think it was, June, I remember going to Alair and saying, hey, what do you think about reapplying? Of course, she was supportive of it. But I had to do it all over again. And there was an immense amount of anxiety in it because every step I took, gathering the transcripts again, writing a new paper, taking the GRE again, putting myself out there was really difficult. All that to say, we're gonna come back to these time and time again. And so again, these Kairos moments aren't just a pandemic. It isn't just death, though it is. It's not just massive societal changes, even though they are good. They can be very, very personal and unique to us.
And you did get in.
I did get in.
And I remember that day when he checked his email again and yelled, and I was hoping it was a happy yell and not another.
That's right. Well, so the second time around, the email came a week early than it was supposed to. So it was totally out of nowhere. And yeah, I kind of yelped. She was really terrified what had happened to me, and it was a good thing. So yes, yes. So we've set the stage. This is a Kairos time. We've decided it's not a Chronos. Chronos is going on, but this is a Kairos moment for each and every one of us. What are the other actors that are on the stage with us? So we identified, there's a lot of these we could have done, but we identified 3 that we thought were very, very important, that were critical to talk about tonight. They are anxiety, loss, and us with others. So we're going to unpack these. Alair's going to unpack them from a therapist's point of view. Is that fair to say? Therapeutic. Still learning. And I'm going to unpack it from an organizational adult development sort of perspective. You'll see how this works out. So this first actor, anxiety. The primary principle here is that for change and transformation to occur, healthy levels of anxiety or stress are necessary. We hope this is a little countercultural. We hope to push things a little bit here. Alair's going to talk about the window of tolerance, and then I'll talk about a very similar concept from my professional world.
I think it's interesting how with things like change and uncertainty and some of the words that were even used, things like risk and anxious and uncertain, and I think a lot of times we think, okay, how do I minimize, or in some ways, some cases, there's an idea of how do I almost like eradicate my anxiety so that I can deal with this change and uncertainty. And the reality is, and I say this to my clients a lot, is like that's not possible. There's no way that so you'll see this slide come up in a second. And if you look at that, is a space in life where we're allowed to, and we feel capable of responding to whatever is going on in life. So there is a sense of stress and pressure that's there, but we can respond to it. If there isn't a sense of stress or pressure, then in some ways we wouldn't get up for work in the morning, or we wouldn't do what we need to do during the day. And so we want to live in that space. And when we're in that space, especially in the midst of change and uncertainty, that's when there can be a lot of personal growth and transformation, and relational too. It's not just an individual thing. But what can happen if you look at the box that's on the left, and it says when stress and trauma shrink your window of tolerance, it doesn't take much to throw you off balance. So a lot of times what happens is that we have this very, very small window of tolerance. And two things can happen if we're at either extreme. There's on the top, it says hyperarousal. And just so you know, as a side note, if you're not able to see these too clearly, we're going to send these all out later after the talk. So hyperarousal is when we feel like our anxiety is just completely out of control, when there's no sense of being able to calm ourselves down, regulate ourselves. We're just like that volcano just exploding. And that's not beneficial or helpful at all either. But on the other side, if we go to this hypoarousal, that's when we're just numb and we're frozen and we're really not able to respond in any sort of helpful way either. So a lot of times with change and uncertainty, I think a lot of times we want to find ways of numbing out or checking out and think, well, that's just how I'll manage it. But in essence, that just kind of freezes everything over. And eventually when the change and uncertainty go away, everything unthaws and you have to deal with it eventually.
A very similar concept occurs in a book by Heifetz and Linsky. It's a book called Leadership on the Line. Many people have read it, not many have written, only 2 wrote it. And there's a principle in here called the productive zone of disequilibrium. And in their book, they denote the difference between 2 different types of problems that we face in our world. One is technical problems. Technical problems are problems that we have the ability and we know how to fix them. So this might be your car breaks down. We know how to fix the car. You might not know it, but the mechanic knows how to fix your car. That's a technical problem. On the other end, there's the adaptive challenges. And adaptive challenges they're challenges and problems, and they have to be adaptive because we don't actually have a way that we know how to fix that. This would be very clearly a Kairos moment. We don't know what is happening necessarily. We don't know the outcome. There's a lot of change, a lot of uncertainty. And so within these adaptive challenges, the book encourages leaders, and really anybody, to do several different things. And one of them, they call it raise the temperature of the room. And what they mean by that is they want to raise the level of anxiety or stress to manageable levels. Now, Alair and I are going to use very similar language in this, but sometimes used in different ways. So try not to make they're not the exact same thing. So in this, if you look, there's disequilibrium on one axis, there's time on the other. And the idea here is that for an adaptive challenge to be adequately dealt with, you need to find this range between the limit of tolerance, which is on the top, and the threshold of learning, which is on the bottom. And you can see there's a little squiggly line that goes right through the upper third of it. And that's that productive range of distress, that in that range is when real change can actually happen. If you take people above that limit of tolerance, several things can happen. It's usually the fight, flight, freeze, or fold. It's one of the 4 Fs that people just go away in very different ways. If you're below that threshold of learning, a couple of things are probably happening. One, it's a technical problem that you've misidentified, or it's work avoidance. That's usually what it is. If you don't know how to respond to something, people are going to naturally want to lower their anxiety to such low levels that they just don't have to deal with it. It's very natural. It's very normal. But as a leader, as someone who is helping people through a time of change, you need to be in this productive zone. And as we said earlier with Kairos, this only happens for a certain amount of time. You notice in the lower right-hand portion that as time goes on, eventually you do drop out of that stress area, that you're in that stressful little area for a certain amount of time, but it doesn't continue forever. And that's the really good news. When you think about this with me and the PhD, when I did not get in that first time, I went first so high above my limit that I think I froze. Like, literally in that moment I froze. Mm-hmm. And then I think I folded very quickly after that. I said, that's it, I'm done. That was my one shot, my best shot. Why would I do that again? And then those next 4 or 5 months, I think I dropped down into that work avoidance. There was still something there. But I was like, nope, la 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 la. Don't want to hear it. Don't want to see it. I did my master's work at USD as well, and it was very connected there. And I remember in those few months, it was hard to go even close to campus, to go see old faculty or friends or whatnot, because I was so hurt by it. And so I went very high above that anxiety and then very low. And then it was finally I found that level, that middle area, because those months that I did reapply, those were very anxious months for me because I was putting myself back out there. It was something I really wanted, but there was no guarantee of what might happen for it. On all of these, you've heard us talk, well, at least so far, on too high and too low. And we're going to give this caution after this, right now, Alair will, and then after the next two as well, just to show that, again, there's a balance here, that we want some Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold in this.
Right, that if we have too much anxiety, then our bodies and our minds are what we call stuck on the on function, where it's just this constant hyper awareness of what's going on and how to deal with things, and we just get overloaded. But if we have too little anxiety and stress, then we're stuck on the off function, where we just numb out. And similar to what Derek said of going back and forth between the two, I think with my mom it was very similar. It was this panic and what does this mean and all these things that I'm losing, and then down to this very sad and low place of not really wanting to invest and engage with relationships. So we want to stay in that middle space for change, for positive change and transformation to occur.
Right. And we're not talking specifically about exact levels of anxiety or what's causing it, because that's going to be different for each and every one of us. So we know we're bringing in broad concepts, but hopefully you can apply at least some of them to where you are right now. The second actor on our stage is loss. This is another fun one that we just get to journey with right now. The big principle here is that all change and transformation requires loss. That loss is ever present and it's excruciatingly real. Not always painful, it is, but it's very, very real. The point of view that I'm bringing this from, or coming from with this, is Erickson's 8 stages of psychosocial development. There's a lot here, we're just going to touch on a little bit of it. The idea that Erickson had, he was mostly a child developmental theorist, but he expanded into adult theory, which is where I live professionally. And he said that there are 8 stages that everyone in life goes through. And these are actually forced stages. You don't get to decide when you're entering into the next one. This is just a simple little graphic showing the 8 different stages. And he tied times in life, you'll see there infant, toddler, preschooler, and whatnot, and actual ages to when these typically occur. So for example, if you are 18 to 40, you're somewhere in the intimacy versus isolation, that's upper green one. And what he said is that in each of these eras, you're dealing with a dichotomy that seems to be mutually exclusive. Either you are intimate or you're isolated. And he said to actually successfully transition this stage, you don't choose either or, you actually have to find a balance between them. What's really interesting is when you are forced to move on to the next stage around a certain time in life, you actually have to revisit all the previous stages that you've passed through. So if we're going from 6 to 7, that upper green to yellow, you'd have to go through the trust versus mistrust, the autonomy, the intuitive, the industry, and all of that. And you have to learn to rebalance these. And this is where a lot of the loss comes in, because if you have certain losses in your life, you actually have to revisit them. Part of my story is that my dad died when I was 10, just before I turned 10. And so every time that I'm moving on to the new stage, whether I want to or not, that dad piece comes back up. For me, that was, that would have been in the identity, the industry and inferiority, which we could spend another hour, my wife could spend another hour talking about how she sees this come up in me, because that's a big part of who I am. I am a doer, that I want to get stuff done, and that definitely goes right back to that time in life. So all that to say is that as we move through Erickson's stages, this idea of revisiting and the required experience of loss over and over again is very, very real. I mentioned this already in my example of applying to the PhD, well, reapplying to PhD. I had to revisit everything. I went through and looked at my transcripts. It was silly. I looked at my transcripts. I couldn't change a darn thing on them, but I still was looking through it. I was revisiting of, oh, why didn't I get an A in this class when I was 18? Which no one really cares about, but I did in that moment. I revisited all different parts of that and experienced that loss over and over again. But it was absolutely necessary for me to experience that loss and to really choose again, what is it that I want here? Do I really want to reapply? And do I want this? Even if I get in, do I want to spend 4 years and a lot of...
About in terms of revisiting, if there are things that we were talking about that we need to revisit, people, anyone watching can feel free to type in questions in the chat box, and we'll have a time at the end. I'm sorry we didn't mention that, but feel free to do that.
Yep.
So in terms of loss, one thing that I want to talk through is Worden's 4 tasks of mourning. So there are a lot of different approaches when we talk about loss, and many of us might be familiar with the 5 stages of grieving. But Worden's 4 tasks is something that I particularly like, not because I like to just check off tasks, because that's not how it works, but it's just a different...
Sorry.
So I'll go through these briefly. So when we approach mourning a loss, the first task is accepting the reality of it. And at times that means that it's a permanent loss, that whatever it was that we lost is not coming back. Other times it might be that we don't know when it's coming back, like being able to go to the grocery store without wearing a mask. Second task, experiencing all the emotions that are involved, which is what we call working through the pain of grief. And a lot of times those emotions might not be ones that we think are appropriate. So we might feel some relief with something that we lost. We might be mourning something and we feel hopeful about something. And so it's allowing ourselves to experience all of those emotions involved. The third task is adjusting to an environment in which the deceased or the loss is missing. So it's, how do I shift and restructure my life without this person or this job or this identity or this dream, whatever it might be. And then the fourth one is to find an enduring connection with the loss while embarking on a new life. So there's a lot of hope in that. It's staying connected to the person, to the dream, the identity, whatever it was that you said goodbye to, and it's finding a way to move into, they talk about moving back into this stream of life. So I know for me, when we were preparing for this, I was mentioning to Derek, I said, I think that loss is the essence of why people come and work with me in therapy, because it's the loss, whether it's grief and for death, loss of a connection in a relationship, of a dream, it's all there. And I know for me, and the loss of what that would mean for the future of my relationship with my mom. And so we still feel those losses for years to come, even if there's just one particular moment when it happens. So similarly with the anxiety piece that we just talked about, if there's too little loss and mourning, then in essence we're just avoiding things. We're ignoring it, we're rejecting that it's real. If there's too much, then we become paralyzed and trapped by it. And the word we like to use is wallow. I think a lot of times we like to, I, as an Enneagram 4, love to wallow in self-pity and melancholy, and I think that self-focused mourning becomes wallowing. But when it's about, anyways, we don't want to get stuck in that.
Yeah. The third actor on the Kairos stage with us is us with others. And Alair and I talked about this in a lot of different ways. And in essence, it comes down to that we never go through change or transformation or uncertainty alone. It's never on our own. It's always with others, for others, by others, that we are changed and transformed. When we say others, that's very broad. That, of course, first and foremost includes God our Father, that He is with us through the Spirit and in Jesus Christ at all times through all parts of life, even when we feel very distant from Him. But it's also this relationship with ourself, that we each have a relationship with ourself. It's a strange thing to think about, but We're always observing ourselves. We're always experiencing ourselves. Sometimes very healthy, sometimes very unhealthy. Years ago, Flood talked about toxic tapes that we hear. And they're not just our own tapes. They can be the words of other people, but we replay them for ourselves. But then it's also this relationship with literal other people. Your spouse, your parents, your children, your friends, your coworkers, whoever it may be. And so when this third actor, it's really a whole group of actors that are on this stage that we're interacting with in these Kairos moments. The part that I'm bringing into this is Bronfenbrenner's bioecology system. And I'm having a really hard time only spending 4 minutes on this because this is where I live. I remember learning this a few years ago, being like, this puts together everything that I see about organizations. She hears me talk about it. I'm always getting a new book. She's like, oh, Bronfenbrenner? Yeah, it's Bronfenbrenner. Bronfenbrenner, he focused on, again, child development. And actually, if you've ever heard of No Child Left Behind, he was the academic thought behind that. And what he said is, okay, a child, you'll see it here in this graphic. He said a child is the center, and this is very much a Western orientation. Other parts of the world would never put an individual thing or a being there, but he did, and it makes sense to us. And he said, there isn't just one environment that this child lives and grows in. It's actually a lot of different environments. And so he called it ecology. The biology piece is the individual thing in the middle, in this case, a child, or in our case right now, us as individuals, or it could be an organization. And then there's all these systems within systems that are interacting with each other, and that's the ecology piece. So he identified 4 different nested systems, and you'll see that there's actually 5 of them here. Try to ignore the chronos system, the outer ring. I don't particularly like how it's denoted in this graphic, so we're actually not going to go into it much. But the other 4 systems are, first of all, the microsystem. These are the systems that we interact with almost constantly. They're the ones that we have a direct influence on and have a direct influence on us. These can be immediate family members. These can be the school you go to or the teachers and friends there, friends in general, your faith community, the place you work. It could be gym. It could also be through social media. These are the things we interact with all the time. So Alair, obviously, in our family is one of my microsystems. The dogs are part of that as well. You could even say the chickens are part of that as well. The last thing I did before leaving the house was to put the chickens away and collect the eggs. These are the things we interact with all the time, and we have direct influences on each other. What he then said is that what's also fascinating is that these microsystems are constantly interacting with each other without us being part of it, and that's the mesosystem. So the classic example he gave was that, say you're a child and you go to school. You have the family you grow up with, say your parents. The school and the parents are actually interacting not necessarily through you all the time. And so that's one of the interesting things is that these microsystems are influencing each other. That can be through being on a PTA board. It could be through teacher-parent conferences. It can be in a lot of different ways that these systems interact with each other and then affect the individual. You go out a broader system, and it's the exosystem. And as we move further out, the individual, us or the child or whatever it may be, has less direct influence on it and vice versa. So the exosystem is an external environment. There's no immediate contact, but there is indirect effect on the individual. So this could be a spouse's workplace. Alair goes to her offices almost every day and has friends and colleagues there that I don't interact with very often, but she does, and it affects her and it affects me. And so there's this triangulation that goes on. This could also be neighborhoods, friends of family, media, kind of the big media type of idea. This could also be government systems and services, both local, state, and federal. I don't have a great influence on the Supreme Court, and most of what they decide doesn't have a great influence on me, but it's still part of it as well. So then you go out to the largest system, the macro system, and this is the larger cultural context. There's less structure here, but it's more of ideas and values that a group of people holds. So this could be, we have Western cultures or Eastern cultures. This could be economies. The national or global economy does affect you and vice versa, but it's in this very large, broad sense. Belief systems, some say national conversations like Black Lives Matter, that is, I don't have a great effect on it necessarily or vice versa, but it's part of the system that we're in. And also international happenings. Most of us aren't directly affected by the blast in Beirut last week, but we are to a degree, to differing degrees. I also mentioned that there's a time component to this, that Chronos system, which again, I don't like actually being the outer ring. I actually like it as a third dimension to this, which again, this graphic doesn't show. And just briefly, the Chronos system is interesting because it talks about how often we interact with different things, but also about when certain things happen in our life. So if you have your first child at 18, it'll be very different than at 28 or 38. If you get married at different times, it's going to affect you differently. And then the last part of the Chronos system is big events that you have no control over. So 9/11 happening for me when I was 16 was very different than happening to my mom when she was in her early 50s, early 60s, somewhere. Very different times. And so this is all to say is that we're never alone, that we often are the center of our own little world, and a lot of Western thought has thought that for a long time. No, the world isn't the center of the universe or even the solar system. But we have all these things that are interacting with us. And especially in these times where we are physically distant from people, from the normal people we want to be with, it can be very isolating. But this is to encourage that, no, there's a lot of people out there that you are interacting with and who want more of it with you.
So another kind of, in terms of interacting with others, another way that we talk about that is what we call attachment. And talk about this all the time in my work. And so many of you may be familiar with what we call attachment styles. And so there are 4 different kinds. And what this is looking at is attachment is how we not only behave in relationships, in close relationships, but how we connect with one another emotionally. And attachment was initially looked at between parents and kids, but over the last several years, there's a lot of research that has explored attachment relationships with adults. And so in times of change and uncertainty, the way that we connect or fail to connect with each other can really impact how we go through that. Ask me about this during the chat if you want, but there's a lot of research that suggests that strong, secure attachment bonds really prevent and protect us from certain kinds of, they just help us to get through challenges of life in a really successful way. So we'll look at these real briefly. So a secure attachment means that I'm comfortable with closeness, but I also have my own autonomy, that I'm able to express myself openly and ask for what I need, and I can receive comfort and support from my attachment bond person. An anxious attachment means that I'm always aware of a threat to the relationship. It's a not so nice word for this is clingy. If you're holding on really tight and always afraid that the relationship is going to end, especially in times of change and uncertainty, that just makes you panic even more. Avoidant attachments are folks who say, in essence, I don't need anybody else. I can take care of life on my own. I'm good. They're not comfortable with closeness. And in fact, if a relationship becomes too close, then they operate in ways that actually push their partner or their loved one away. And then a combination of the two is pretty rare. It's called a dismissive avoidant. It's basically I'm scared and worried and trying to hold on to the relationship, but I'm acting like I'm not. So kind of come close, but stay away. And so in essence, I personally believe that this is how God wired us to be, is in relationship with each other. I think that we're meant to lean on each other and to be there for one another in some really powerful ways. And I know for me in what we went through with my mom and that side of the family, we leaned heavily on people in our community. And we really asked them and asked them to remind us of what was true about us and about our relationship. And there were times where I think for me, and I think I can speak for Derek, is that we were in some ways almost afraid to be really honest because we were afraid of similar kinds of judgment or criticism or things like that. So again, if we look at a bit of a caution in what we shared about this piece of with others, too much focus inward creates this isolation And it's easy to turn inward and to, oftentimes that can look like some addictive behaviors, some self-harming behaviors, things like that. But then too much focus outward on other people can look like codependency, control, caretaking. And so again, it's that too much, too little that we want to be careful about.
So those are our three actors. And just in the next 10 or so minutes, it looks like we'll go a little bit over 8 o'clock into the Q&A time, Q&R time. But we want to talk about, what do we do with this? How do we do all of this? Because it's all nebulous, it's still uncertain. You might be looking at your screen and be like, Derek and Alair, you didn't provide anything yet. Sorry, you can end anytime you want. But there are three parts that we really want to encourage you in that are our action steps.
So the first is, sounds like a simple question, but it's, I think, really significant, is what do you want? When it comes to change and uncertainty, I think a question of what is it that you want is so important, because I think it's easy for us to be in a place of this is all happening to me, would be, what do you sense that you're being invited into? I think we're both big fans of asking, what's the invitation here? Because in the midst of tragedy and loss and uncertainty and confusion, there's always an invitation that God and Jesus and Holy Spirit are always inviting us into something. And so it's a real important question to ask.
And the first step, the only thing we would say, do this if you want to be able to answer either of these questions, either now or at any time in life. The first thing we would say is it's an invitation to stillness. And often the Psalms 46:10 piece of be still and know that I am God is used. And there is a lot of peace in that. There's a lot of, okay. And often Christians interpret that as be quiet in the presence of God, which it does mean that, and that's a very good thing. But again, like with some of the terms we talked about earlier with Kairos, there's a real deep, rich meaning in the Bible about this. The word still is translated into Hebrew as the word rapa, which means to slacken, let down, or to cease. It's a little different than being still in someone's presence or being quiet. In Nehemiah, I love this where it's used. He talks about the dropping of the hands from the work. And in Nehemiah, it's all about rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem. And so this idea of being still is dropping your hands from work. And you think about when you build a wall, you're grasping rocks and stones, you're pulling ropes and pulleys and however you build a wall. But this idea of being still is you're literally putting down the work that you're doing. That's probably very good work, but you need to put it down sometimes. And then also in Judges, it's this idea to sink, relax, or abate. There's also a way that this is sometimes used in spiritual warfare. When you think about the armor of God that we love to talk about, and we have kids color in sheets and whatnot in school, you think about there's only one of those elements of the armor of God that's actually an offensive weapon, and that's the sword. And the rest of it's all defensive. And so it's this idea that actually let God do the work, the warfaring for you. That one of our primary jobs in spiritual warfare is really just to stand. We're not to go out and attack the enemy, that's God and the Spirit's role, but that we are supposed to stand firm in who he is and who we are in him. And so that's the stillness piece of, it's not just to be quiet in front of him, it certainly is that, but it's this relaxing, the opening of the hands, the Alair is very communicative without words, and sometimes I get really frustrated by her sighs because I don't know what they communicate, but often they're communicating a real like cool, and it's a stillness thing. Sometimes not.
Sometimes it's a frustration thing.
If we're honest. And so these three questions of what are you being invited into, and that's what does God want to grow in you? This goes back to those seeds. What's already planted in your life? It could be from your birth, it could be at any point, but what does he want to germinate and to grow? And then from that, what is it that you want? Because we get a choice in all that. That is one of the most incredible gifts of Christianity, is that we do have a choice. But then also that first step, we would encourage it towards stillness. Mm-hmm. And again, that will look very differently. We're probably never going to give here are top 10 things to do to be still, because they probably won't, most of them won't apply to you. But find those ways to put down the work, to take a deep breath. And then lastly, we just want to end with a little bit of encouragement. And this goes back to that one line that we started tonight with, is that change and uncertainty are unique and unparalleled times for God to intervene in our lives and for us to choose his life-changing transformation. A good friend of ours, David, he calls this the gift of dormancy. We had a Zoom call with him a week and a half ago, and he was saying, this is an incredible time, this dormant time where everything is chaotic. It's a time that everything can change. And our charge and encouragement is to run toward the smoke. Often in these times we want to sit back and protect ourselves. We need to stock up on toilet paper and paper towels. We bring it up because I did that exact same thing. There's a protection piece of this. I don't know what's going on. But now that we've gotten through some of the initial stages, it's like, well, who can we go toward? Who do we know in our life who needs companionship right now? Who do we need to reach out to and say, I need a companion. Can you be with me in this? There's that other part. There's acknowledging that loss part and the anxiety that we also face as well.
I think an invitation or an encouragement as well is in thinking through the three different actors, so to speak. Maybe it's something of sitting with the anxiety of, am I letting myself experience any anxiety? Am I trying to just numb out, or am I becoming overwhelmed and flooded by it? And what potential transformation could be there? Or am I letting myself grieve what I need to grieve? I think about, like, Derek didn't get to have a graduation this spring, and as did a lot of people miss out on. And so are we grieving that? And the us with others piece, maybe it's looking at how are these different spheres of my life influencing me? How am I connecting with other people? I mean, like I said, we're not going to give you any answers. We're just going to give you a lot of questions and a lot of things to sit with. And in the midst of that, ultimately, it's a question of how is this impacting God's kingdom? How are we bringing God's kingdom to earth? And are we running towards that? And are we allowing ourselves to sit in the discomfort and allow God to use that to change and transform us?
It really is an opportunity for us to release ourselves back to the kingdom and to his purposes. We just can't say it enough. Run toward that smoke. This idea, this notion of a wounded healer. We're all incredibly wounded in different ways. But how can we use that? No matter if you feel fully healed or it's just barely stitched up, how can you use that? I can't tell you how often. It's one of my greatest joys in life, and it's kind of strange to say, but when I meet someone new or when I get to know someone, they're a friend, and I find out their story, when I find out someone, whether it's a stranger or a friend, who has lost a parent when they were young, that to me is an instant connection. Before they even usually know that I also had lost a parent when I was young, there's an instant connection there, that there's this idea of like, oh, I know what you've been through in a sense, and you know what I've been through in a sense. And that's that wounded healer of, I'm incredibly wounded from that. Yes, I have a great father now, my mom remarried, but their wound is still there. And so how can you go to people? And this is also, as Christians, in a world that is upending itself, we're upending each other. This is this opportunity to be bringers of hope, to be bringers of reconciliation, of justice, mercy, and truth. These are tall orders for sure, especially when the chaos is not just going on around us, but in us. But that's what we're called to be. That's what we're called to do. I think that's it. Yeah. We're going to enter now a time of question and response. Sometimes we say Q&A. I missay it because we don't have answers. We only have responses and maybe more questions, unfortunately. So we're going to have Mindy, who's off camera, and let us know some of the questions that have come in over the past hour. If you have more questions, feel free to type them in now, and she'll send us the ones that we're going to answer.
Okay, we're going to start off with one from someone named Strength. Myers-Briggs affect how we process through these changes? And are there types that are like better suited for these types of transitions or not?
Great question. I think you have the answer. So
Oh,
can
you
I?
guys
Can I?
repeat
Do
the
you wanna-
question?
Yeah, I'll repeat it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Alair will answer this one. The question from Jen is, how do our personalities play into this? Whether that's Enneagram, Strength Finder, Myers-Briggs, Piers-Marson, all the big ones out there. How does that affect how we respond in these times? And without even looking, I could feel my wife getting excited. My guess, it has to do with the Enneagram, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yes. Oh, Jen, thank you. Oh, so any of these assessments are particularly helpful in understanding how we're wired, and I'm a big Enneagram geek, and Derek is certified in administrator of the Myers-Briggs, and so I think, so in terms of types and all that, gosh, we could spend a lot of time on that. I think what comes to mind, so with the Enneagram, they have, the Enneagram is divided up into what they call 3 different centers of intelligence: the head, the heart, and the body, or the gut. And each center has a certain way that they initially respond to things. So the head responds with, what do I think? The heart responds with, how do I feel? And the gut or the body responds with, what do I do? So in times of change and uncertainty, each type is primed to respond instinctively in a certain way. So we're both in the heart triad, and which means that we respond initially with, how do I feel? And what the Enneagram, what I have understood and what it talks about, is that we want to go for a balance of all 3. We want to have this balanced approach where we might have this knee-jerk reaction of, what do I think or feel or do? But then we incorporate the other 2. And so I think about, if you know your Enneagram type, I think what would be really helpful, and this is something you can just look up, is what's your dominant type or your dominant center, and then what's your repressed center, and how do you incorporate all 3? So that's what comes to mind for the Enneagram.
In a similar way, Myers-Briggs would say there's no best way for anyone to respond, or a type that is better at responding to stress. There is a whole area of research in Myers-Briggs that talks about being in the grip. And it's basically, what do you do when you are overwhelmed? And what you actually end up doing is you revert to your inferior functions, which means you act out in all these ways that you really don't normally act out in. And if you've ever seen a friend in a stressful situation and maybe not know that they're in it, but you're like, wow, Derek's just acting really weird today. It probably is because they're acting out of stress. And so they're probably in an unhealthy place with it. But so again, like with Enneagram, it's going to be very specific. Mm-hmm. There was something else with what you were saying that was important. Oh, all it was not that you should go take 1,001 personality assessments, but the more that you can understand about yourself, the better. By far, from our experience, the best developed, because it's been developed for literally thousands of years, personality type that's out there. So invest in 1 or 2 of them and really get to know yourself deeply in that. Next question.
Awesome. Caleb is asking, what is, in your minds, what is the invitation from this pandemic? Socially, culturally, communitally. And I know you wrote this before you said, like, justice, love, mercy.
Got it.
Like, so I think
Sure.
maybe just revisiting that too with that question.
Do you want to repeat it?
What is the invitation
Yeah.
to this question?
Okay, thanks, Minnie. So the question is, in this season with this pandemic specifically, what is, quote unquote, the invitation that I guess we would suggest? And I can think of a couple, or just one that comes to my mind. And I think we touched on this, so sorry, Caleb, if we're just repeating back the answer. It goes back for me to that gift of dormancy. So I can't tell you how many people I've heard who've said, gosh, it's almost like now we have to slow down, or we don't have all these activities that our kids are doing, or we're not running around to a million places. And for a lot of people, talk about anxiety, that brings up a whole lot of anxiety, because now you have to be present with yourself and with people around you. But something that Derek and I have talked a lot about for years is this idea of Sabbath rhythm and developing this rhythm of life where you have periods of rest and slowness. And so this is a kind of like government-induced period of slowness, which sounds awful, but anyways. So I think maybe the invitation is, can you let yourself be still, and can you see what fruits spring up from that? Yeah.
Typically in these Kairos moments or eras, we don't choose to enter into them. That they are given to us, some would say forced upon us, however you want to see it. And I think that's the great invitation and the opportunities, that we actually lost an immense amount of control very quickly. Each individual has, but also collectively as a society and as a globe, we've lost that almost overnight. And I think a lot of the discussions and frustrations we see across the country and really in the responses to the pandemic is this sense of wanting to control. And so one of the greatest invitations is to actually maybe let's let go a bit. In simple things like maybe not fight a mask ordinance, but in really, really deep ways of like, hold on, this is all different. Now I spend a ton of time with my roommates or my family, and how can I build those relationships? So it's just an opportunity. But again, that key part of it has been put on us. We have not chosen that. And that's part of the struggle, but also the blessing in this as well.
Can I add to that real quickly? I think one thing that we talked about a lot, but I don't think I mentioned or we mentioned yet, is that when it comes to things like anxiety or just kind of the reactions that we have to let's say this pandemic, we also want to say that there's a caution too in terms of things like mental illness, addiction, abuse. Like those are things that in times of uncertainty and stress, and certainly we don't want to condone any of like any of those kinds of comfort when the discomfort is serious mental illness or addiction or things like that. So lots of support that's available, just wanting to make a note of that.
Yep.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, are there any books that you would recommend to dive into this subject further?
The question is, are there any books or resources out there that we would recommend on this topic?
Yes.
About
Lots.
30 dozen. Anything?
Oh gosh.
Going back to that story that we gave at the very beginning about the nun, some cows, and herbs.
That's so funny.
It's again called Sabbath, and it's by Wayne Mueller. It was first published in 2000. Anything right now about rest and rhythms would be, I think, golden right now for all of us, because our rhythms are completely thrown off, and that's probably a good thing because most of our rhythms pre-COVID were not healthy. Just putting that out there. Maybe it's not you, but it certainly was me. And so this is, again, that opportunity to really reset everything. And yeah, that's something that I would encourage.
Yeah, I'd say anything by Henry Nouwen. Big fan of Henry Nouwen, great spiritual writer. In terms of attachment and relationships, so a couple that I often recommend, one is it's called Attached, and it basically explains adult attachment relationships. There's a faith-based similar book, it's called How We Love, or Created for Connection. So those are great in just understanding more of how, as humans, we're wired for attachment and ways of understanding that a bit more.
In terms of relationships, there's a book, Soul Companions? Sacred Companions, that talks about soul companions. And that's by David Benner. And it's a thick text, but if you really want to get into godly, God-given relationships and how to identify those and how to encourage those, David Benner and Sacred Companions. As part of if you haven't RSVP'd to this, do go back. I believe that link is still open, because if you do RSVP to it, probably tomorrow, maybe the day after, we'll be sending out a lot of the graphics we used today, but then also a resource list along with each one of those. Next question.
This person is saying, I too suffered the loss of a parent during school age. In reference to the psychosocial stages, how does not fully experiencing a stage affect you as a parent or spouse in adulthood?
Great question. And actually, I'm glad that I have a few more minutes to go into this. So if you missed it or if it wasn't clear before, Erickson said we go through these four stages throughout life, and that in each stage there's a dichotomy that we're wrestling with, and that the aim is to balance them, not to choose one. If you balance them well, it's a very relative term, then a virtue will come out from it. If it's unbalanced severely one way or the other, there's going to be a vice attached to this. So in that school age period, so for me it was a stage 4, which is industry versus inferiority. That's generally ages 5 to 12. The question that we're asking ourselves is, can I make it in this world? And so when we lose a parent at that stage, that's a huge hit of, can I survive in this world? Because that's at that stage you're actually beginning to have some distance and separation of, oh, I am not my parents. I am different from them. I can make my own choices. So if that goes well, the virtue is competence, that you learn, okay, I can make it in this world, and I'm going to be okay, I will survive. If you don't navigate that well, if it's imbalanced, probably what you'll be feeling in that, and even today, is inadequacy, that you're going to feel like you are not enough. And so the invitation is, you don't have to wait to move into that next stage to go back and revisit this. You can start now. And as soon as the question was read of, if I lost a parent and what can I do about that, I felt that connection with whoever asked it. And that's the invitation, is go back and see, where is it that you might feel competent. If you feel very competent, you might have navigated that well. Otherwise, you're going to feel inadequate. And that inadequacy is going to show up in all areas of life, not just one, not just as a parent, not just as a spouse or a friend or as a colleague. It's going to show up in probably all of them. One part that's also interesting in this is that there's environmental influences. And so in that stage 4, which I'm guessing is what this individual was in, the environmental influences are neighbors and others at school. So think back to that era, and were there neighbors, were there family, friends, were there peers at school that were really helpful for you in that? I can think back to, for me, it was my godparents, Gene and Herman Steinbrenner. They were critical in that stage for me. I had never been close to them before, but because they had been best friends with my dad even before he married my mom, they were people that were already had an influence in my life that I really went to and looked to. Just in case this individual was in the 5th stage, and sometimes it's hard to identify which one you're in. The 5th stage is identity versus role confusion, which this is classic teenager stuff. And so this is ages 13 to 19 generally. And this is the question of, who am I and where am I going? This is a clear differentiation from the parents, and it's really that identity of who am I? And if we don't answer that well, there is that role confusion. In this, the part, the environmental influences are peers and role models, which makes total sense if you ever have had a teenager. They look to their friends more than they look to you. Mm-hmm. And then the virtue that comes from this is fidelity. That if you navigate this well, if you balance it well, that you're going to have a lot of that in life. The vice is rebellion, which that era is known for a lot of. So I hope that helps. Also, we should say that our contact information will be available with this resource. And so if you have more questions about it, you'll be able to contact us directly.
Great questions.
Yeah, it is. They are.
The last question that came in is from the same person with what you're
Great.
saying. I don't know if we have time for this, but she said, what are you talking about? Remind me about the ACE studies.
Oh, the ACEs.
And resilient due to strong relationships.
So the ACEs is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And so it was a study that was done by Kaiser, actually, with 17,000 children. And they looked at different life experiences that children went through. And then they followed them, I forget exactly how long, I'm sorry, but well into adulthood. And they looked at how these, what they call adverse life experiences, affected children in physical health ways, mentally, emotionally, things like that. And so what they found and they came up with was this scale of, now they call it adverse childhood experiences. And so it's everything from, did you witness like domestic violence? Did you have someone in your home who went to jail? Did you, things like abuse and whatnot? And so death of a parent. And so I think that's what they're referring to. Was there anything specific in that? Okay. So I think from my experience in working with children, and adults, is that these kinds of Kairos moments that we'd call an adverse life experience significantly shape us. And when we look at kids who have strong, secure attachments, it might not be with their biological parent, it could be with a caregiver, a family member, that helps them develop this, I think resilient was the word that was used, this resiliency in going through life. And that's also what we look at with kids when it comes to that window of tolerance, that a lot of times in the work I do with kids is that I'm helping them grow their window of tolerance. So we talk about it as your struggle muscle. How do you build up a struggle muscle where when change and uncertainty, for example, happen, there's a sense of resiliency and a sense of, I can make it through. I know who I can rely on. I know I'm strong. And so that's what we're working on. And a lot of times what can happen is that kids do go through these really awful life experiences and they don't have anyone to lean on, or they don't know how to get through it. And then that's where you get a lot of just unprocessed trauma and things like that. So anyways, but if that helps.
I think that's it. Again, if you have other questions or if this has brought up anything for you that is critical, we want to acknowledge, as Alair did earlier, that these sort of conversations about loss and grief and even some of the stories we tell can trigger certain things in us. And I'm very thankful that we were all together tonight. I'm thankful for everyone who will watch this in the future who wasn't in the same time of space-time, all that. But there are incredible resources out there. On Flood's website, which is both diveintoflood.com and floodchurch.org. I think so.
Yeah.
There are resources for if you need to talk to someone tomorrow. There's a great list of counselors and therapists there. Of course, if you need something tonight, go to friends and family and sit with this. This can bring up a whole lot of different things. And again, our encouragement to you is that in this time of uncertainty, time of change, where we as a nation, as a culture, and as a world don't know what it's going to mean in the end, we do know that in the end that God is present, that God is with us, that the Spirit is right next to us, and that is our great hope, and that from that we can go to other people. We're going to end with a very quick benediction, but again, thank you for letting us be part of your evening and your week. This benediction comes from the end of Jude. There are a lot of great benedictions straight from the Bible. Jude, tiny little book that often gets overlooked. To him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. To the only God, our Savior, be glory, majesty, power, authority, through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore. Amen.